Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 4, Celebrating the Rosenbach's Treasures, in which I take you behind the scenes into the Rosenbach's exciting new gallery exhibition project, Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection. We will engage in conversations about the global connections of our remarkable rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts. In this episode, I'll speak with Fran Baker, Archivist and Librarian at Chatsworth House Trust, about the role of country house libraries in preserving some of Great Britain's most spectacular bookish treasures. What do you treasure? Many of us treasure books, works of art, precious mementos, and other objects that hold special memories, connect us to important people, places, and moments in our lives, or simply reflect our interests and passions. Sometimes those objects might be valuable in the eyes of the world, a very rare book, for example, or an important work of art. Other times, the objects might only hold value to us, a grandparent's recipe book, an old letter from a loved one, or a gift from a family member or a friend. Each of us gets to decide what we treasure and how we treasure it. We at the Rosenbach are working on an exciting new project to share what we treasure with all of you. The Rosenbach holds some of the world's most treasured rare books, manuscripts, artworks, and other artifacts. Some of the pieces are famous, whereas others we treasure simply because of the stories they allow us to explore with our visitors. We love sharing these treasures with everyone who encounters us online and who walks through our doors on beautiful Delancey Place in Philadelphia. In order to make our key collecting areas as accessible as possible, we are unveiling 3 new permanent exhibition galleries titled Treasures from the Rosenbach's Collection. The first gallery, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, opened in June of 2024. The second gallery, focused on Judaica, book history, continental Europe, and the Rosenbach family, will open in June 2025. The third gallery, titled Literature and History of the Americas, will open in June 2026. You can see photos of the first gallery, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, online at rosenbach.org. The Treasures Project is truly a team effort at the Rosenbach. Our board of directors, my staff colleagues, as well as an expert team of contractors and I are having a fantastic time identifying which areas of our collection we should highlight in each space, what key objects should be on display, and how the galleries should look, feel, and even sound for our visitors. If you haven't stopped by Delancey Place recently, I hope you'll visit for an introductory tour or to purchase one of our new gallery and garden tickets so that you can explore the first Treasures Gallery. Objects rotate in and out on a regular basis, so there is always something exciting to see. It's been such a pleasure to dive into our collection and learn more about our incredible holdings as part of the Treasures Project. Doing so has deepened my appreciation for just how vast, wide-ranging, interesting, important, and in some ways very personal our collection at the Rosenbach truly is. This special mini-season of the Rosenbach Podcast expands on some of the themes and ideas you will explore in the galleries, and I present the 3 episodes to you as a warm invitation to visit us in person and explore our galleries, historic spaces, and signature programs. The first 2 episodes of the season address themes in British history, literature, and culture. The final episode offers a story that is both intensely local to Philadelphia and intensely global in its origins and implications. All 3 of these episodes are inspired by objects in our collection. Each includes a conversation with a member of the Rosenbach community. Today's episode is inspired by the Rosenbach's British literature collection and Dr. Rosenbach's fascinating history of buying books in the United Kingdom. Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach was one of the world's most prominent booksellers in the first decades of the 20th century, in no small part because he established a successful transatlantic business purchasing books out of libraries in Great Britain and selling them to wealthy collectors in the United States. Especially noteworthy is Dr. Rosenbach's purchase of objects from great country house libraries and other ancient collections. This got me curious. What role did the great aristocratic families of England play in preserving bookish treasures in their country homes, and what role do country house libraries play in Great Britain's cultural life today? To explore these questions, I hope you'll travel with me to visit the country library at Chatsworth House, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Devonshire and home to a spectacular book collection. Librarian and archivist Fran Baker will help us learn more about this important assemblage. Fran, thank you so much for inviting us into the beautiful library at Chatsworth House and for sharing your reflections on the history and importance of the English Country House Library.
Thank you.
Tell our listeners a bit about Chatsworth House and the family who reside there. What role has Chatsworth played in British history, and what kinds of collections does the house contain?
Well, today, the collections at Chatsworth are looked after by the Chatsworth House Trust, which is a charity that was founded in 1981 and supported by an endowment from the Devonshire family. So this essentially means all the income we make from our visitors and supporters goes towards preserving, conserving and caring for the house, the collections, the gardens, for the benefit of everybody. And the family now here pay a market rent to the trust in order to live in the house. The present Duke of Devonshire's son, Lord Burlington, and his family have recently moved in while the Duke and Duchess have moved out. So we're in the middle of quite a big period of change at the moment. So it's a very interesting time. In terms of the sort of history of the family, their surname, as opposed to their title, is Cavendish. And the Cavendish family have been associated with Chatsworth since 1549. We know there was a house here at that time, though we don't know exactly what its footprint was. It was purchased by Sir William Cavendish, who's the second husband of a really remarkable lady known as Bess of Hardwick. So Bess came from a relatively modest background, but she rose socially to become probably the sort of second most powerful woman in Elizabethan England after the Queen, really. William was her second husband and father to all her children. She was a native of the county of Derbyshire, where Chatsworth is located, and she sort of persuaded her husband to sell off some of his lands in the south in order to establish a big estate focused on the Chatsworth area. So they moved here in about 1549, embarked on a huge building project, which resulted in this wonderful Elizabethan Chatsworth House. She took another step up the social scale on marrying her fourth husband, George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, making her a countess. We also know that her husband was the custodian of Mary, Queen of Scots, when she was being kept prisoner in England, and that Mary stayed at Chatsworth several times, and we've still got some rooms named after her. Today's Cavendish family are descended from Bess's second son, another William. There are many Williams in the family history. He became first Earl of Devonshire in 1618. It's probably worth noting that Devon is a county which has historically been known as Devonshire, and it's in the far southwest of England, around 250 miles away from here. So the title doesn't have anything geographic connection with the family or their properties. It was a title that was available at that time in 1618. The house remained relatively unchanged until the 1690s, when it was completely rebuilt in a magnificent Baroque style by the 4th Earl of Devonshire, later 1st Duke. His house does remain standing today, but there was another huge building project in the 19th century carried out by the 6th Duke. He added the great north wing to the original square Baroque house. So it has this wonderful Belvedere tower at the end and a suite of great entertainment rooms, so a big dining room, sculpture gallery, an orangery. From Bess's time onwards, really, the family have played a really prominent role in British cultural and political life. So other famous family members have included Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who was an 18th century sort of socialite, political organiser and author. There was Henry Cavendish, the 18th century scientist. The 8th Duke of Devonshire was a significant Liberal politician in the 19th century. His ancestor, the 4th Duke, had been Prime Minister of England for a short time in the 1750s. The 7th Duke of Devonshire was also very interested in science and promoting kind of scientific and technical education in the 19th century, and was also a big industrialist. Then the 6th Duke in the 19th century was a huge collector of art, books, and much more. So it's a very kind of varied and influential family. And each generation of that family really has shaped and augmented the collections that are at Chatsworth today. So they include one of Europe's most significant art collections. So there are over 1,000 old master drawings, for example, as well as one of the most important private libraries in the country, which is what we're sort of focusing on today. We also have the family archives, which are one of the sort of largest family and estate archives in the country, still held in their place of origin, sort of documenting the family's activities, the running of their estates, and the lives of those who lived and worked on those estates over 500 years.
Wow, well, it sounds like both a fascinating place and a fascinating collection. And before we dive into the library, which I'm so excited to learn more about, I'm curious if you could just tell me a bit more about how you ended up pursuing a career in country house librarianship. I mean, I think there are so many kinds of institutions that hold libraries. To work at a magnificent country house in the north of England must be a very unique sort of library experience.
I think it is, yes. And I should be frank here. So my role at Chatsworth is archivist and librarian. And I'm not actually a librarian by training. My professional qualification is in archive management, which is very distinct from the librarianship qualification. It's just that in the country house sector, the roles of sort of curator, archivist, librarian are often combined, even into a single post, depending on the size of the institution. So here we do have specialist curators who look after the art collections and the textiles, but my team is responsible for both the archives and the library, and we are sort of archivists by background. I've been here for 5 years now, and I actually moved from a lovely historic library in Manchester, the John Rylands Library, which is part of the university now. And I worked there as an archivist, but I did have quite a lot to do with the book collections as well. I use them in teaching for students and research purposes, public events, that kind of thing. And the collections there are interesting in that lots of them are large estate archives, either owned or on deposit. So archives very like what we hold at Chatsworth. And the library's 2 foundation collections were essentially sort of aristocratic libraries. So the core book collection, which was acquired in the 1890s at the Rylands, came from the Spencer family. Many of those were collected by the second Earl Spencer, who was Duchess Georgiana Devonshire's brother. So there were some obvious kind of synergies between those 2 collections. And I've got an interest in book history. I did a sort of MPhil degree in my spare time looking at textual scholarship and the history of texts. So when I decided to move on from my former role, I was really kind of looking out for a job in a wonderful historic building with amazing collections. So Chatsworth kind of fitted the bill, which is how I ended up here, really. And I think what makes the archives and library here so special is that they are still held in their place of origin and they're still kind of living collections. So they're still being added to. So you have that sort of additional layer of, context and appropriateness of place.
Fascinating. Tell me more about the Chatsworth Library. What kind of material do you hold, and what are a few of your favorite items in the collection?
That's a very difficult one to answer. So, the library here is outstanding. It's grown up kind of organically over many centuries, so it reflects the tastes and interests of lots of different people. And it also contains collections that originated in multiple other houses owned by the family. We know there are some books in the collection that were acquired by the first Earl of Devonshire, Bess's son. He invested in the Virginia Company, and his son, the second Earl, was on the council of the Virginia Company. So there are some sort of significant pamphlet publications about Virginia from that time in the collection that might be of interest to an American audience, including John Smith's famous 1612 map, Virginia. Most of those books at that time were held at Hardwick Hall, which is about 20 miles away from here. That was the family's main home at that time. And the library at that time was also quite strongly shaped by Thomas Hobbes, the political philosopher, who he's now sort of internationally important in his own right. But he was also the tutor to the second and third Earls of Devonshire and acted as their librarian. So he stayed on with the family for decades and really transformed the collection, the sort of library collection, into something of real kind of academic and historical significance. He had a catalogue, a shelving system, numbering system, and around 2,000 books. Other family members have added significantly to the collection. The second Duke was a big connoisseur, art, but also collected books, including incunabula, if I can say it, incunabula. That is books printed before 1501, as well as some lovely books bound for the French bibliophile Jean Grolier in the 16th century, which are really, really sought after by collectors. In 1748, there was a very important dynastic marriage. So the future fourth Duke of Devonshire married Lady Charlotte Boyle, who was the sole heiress of her father, the third Earl of Burlington. And this brought a huge and very rich inheritance into the family, including multiple properties and their contents, including all the books. So the Earl of Burlington was known as the Architect Earl. He was a patron of William Kent, and he was highly influenced by Palladio. He had over 1,000 books, so lots of really important architectural volumes, books on antiquities, travel, the classics, and so on. And his collection did include one of my favourite items in the collection, and it's not typical of his library at all. It was actually a gift to him from Field Marshal Wade. So it's a beautiful illuminated manuscript book of hours, so a sort of private prayer book on vellum, dating from the early 16th century, which, as well as being a really, really beautiful thing, is also inscribed by King Henry VII to his daughter Margaret Tudor. So it has this very interesting provenance as well. Moving on a little bit, both Duchess Georgiana and her husband, the fifth Duke, were keen acquirers of books. The Duchess had a passion for reading and writing, so we've got lots of Enlightenment works on moral philosophy, political philosophy, romantic poetry, French literature from their time. And there's also another one of my favourite items appears amongst the Duchess's books. So it was a gift from her brother, the big book collector, Lord Spencer. And it's this beautiful 1514 edition of Petrarch's poetry in Italian, published by Aldus Manutius. And although it's a printed book, it's been really lavishly decorated by hand. It's absolutely stunning. It's thought that it may have been commissioned originally for a member of the De Medici family and sort of passed down through various collectors over time. We've got some amazing illustrated bird books and natural history books that were put together by the 6th Duke, 7th Duke and 11th Duke. But the greatest bibliophile in the family's entire history really is definitely the 6th Duke of Devonshire, who acceded to the dukedom in 1811. So he inherited an already very rich collection of libraries, but he went on to acquire multiple further collections in their entirety, as well as making all sorts of purchases at big auctions and sales. So he added lots more incunables to the collection. He inherited the library of his relative, the scientist Henry Cavendish, which has some amazing scientific texts in, as well as travel and lots of other topics. And Cavendish's library itself extended to more than 12,000 volumes. So he had a house in London that was essentially his library, and he loaned books to interested scientists. And his book stamp appears all over the place in our collection. The 6th Duke, as well as being a great reader, was also a writer. So he produced a kind of guidebook to Chatsworth and Hardwick that was very personal, very idiosyncratic and readable. He had it privately printed in 1844 and sort of distributed it to family and friends. He loaned a copy to Charles Dickens, who praised his writing style. I think the Duke was very flattered by that. And one of the other treasures of the library, and I think maybe it's my favourite item, it's a large paper copy of that handbook of the 6 Dukes, which has been extra illustrated by Lady Louisa Egerton, who was a daughter of the 7th Duke. It's 6 large volumes, and it's truly unique. So it's, his history and guide to the 2 properties, but she's filled it up with watercolors, pen and ink sketches, engravings, and manuscripts. So it's wonderful kind of material thing that's very unique. And one other thing I rather like about the 6 Dukes book collection is that, as well as being a bibliophile and collecting these historic texts that maybe he didn't read, they just look nice on the shelf, he loved reading contemporary literature. So we've got this really nice collection of 19th century novels. And in some cases, you can tell he was following the novels in serial form as they were being issued, either weekly or monthly, and then having them bound up in a volume, sort of rather than waiting to buy the deluxe volume edition when it came out. He was literally, with all the rest of the country who were into literature, kind of getting his weekly or monthly dose of the serial version, which I think is rather nice. And although many of the sort of most special and valuable books from the library was sold during the 20th century, the result of things like inheritance tax and death duties, despite that, I still think it's one of the finest private libraries in the country.
I love the story of having to create a guide to your own house to distribute to family members so that they can find their way around. And the extra illustrated version you described sounds really spectacular. I'll love to see pictures of it at some point.
Yeah, you certainly can.
So tell me more about the library spaces themselves. I know that Chatsworth has breathtakingly beautiful interior spaces, the library included, and I imagine that many other materials, books and archival materials, are probably housed elsewhere on the property. What is it like to manage a collection contained inside a stately home?
Well, it is an interesting challenge. So the main library at Chatsworth today, the beautiful library that people kind of peek at on the visitor route, was a creation of the 6th Duke. So it was converted from being the long gallery of the house in the 17th century to a library. And the 6th Duke essentially desperately needed somewhere to keep his ever-increasing book collection. He worked with the architect Sir Geoffrey Wyatville to design the north wing, but I think it perhaps reflects the importance he placed on his books that he started creating the library in 1815, 3 years before Wyatville came on board. Basically, it was the first thing he set to work on, sort of updating and creating. And many of the books in there are still in their original locations, as determined by the 6th Duke. He wrote in his handbook, actually, about how he kind of organised his books and classified them. He had great fun. He called it booking. So he'd say, I spent a day booking, which was kind of organising books in the library. But the volumes in that library and the couple of rooms just outside it number only around 17,000. And we think, because we haven't documented the entire book collection yet, we've got around 37,000 books in total. So there are 20,000 that aren't in the library, and many of them are stored in attics rooms. So these were former servants' bedrooms. And of course, in addition to that, there are thousands of books stored in the private side of the house where the family live that will ultimately become, or at least a large portion of them will become, part of the main historic library collection as well. So I suppose a major challenge with managing those collections is simply the environment they're stored in. We can't hope to kind of achieve the sort of environmentally controlled stores that you might encounter in a modern library, like a national or university library. So we do monitor the temperature and humidity, but we only have rather limited means of actually trying to control it. We have an integrated pest management system, so we're trying to minimize damage from insects and pests. We've embarked on a long and slow process of trying to get all the most important, significant early books in the attic stores boxed, so in individual bespoke boxes to provide a kind of barrier against the environment. Expansion space is another issue. So people might look at Chatsworth from the outside and think, how can you possibly be running out of space? But we are. So going forward, we do need to put some thought into where things are going to go, because the library is going to continue to grow. So there are multiple challenges, but it's still, quite fun.
Well, as someone who works at a library that also lives in an historic home here in Philadelphia, many of those challenges sound familiar. And the Rosenbach is, small, of course, by comparison to Chatsworth in terms of square footage, but similar challenges. If most of your book collection lives in an historic library space, what do you do as the collection continues to grow? How do you balance access and sort of the visual beauty of the space with the reality of preservation, conservation, security needs, all those things. So it's an interesting, ever-present challenge. Now, tell me more about what role country house libraries play in preserving the books and manuscripts important to British culture. Obviously, Chatsworth is a sort of remarkable example of a country house and its associated library and other collections, but there are so many other such institutions in the nation today. How do you sense that the Devonshires respond to this responsibility of caring for this important private collection?
Well, I think, sadly, lots of country house libraries did see major sales in the 20th century with things like inheritance tax that I've already mentioned. Often books were kind of the first thing to go. But, at Chatsworth, I think while there were significant sales, I think we're fortunate still in just how complete the library remains. And this isn't unique to us. The core collections of many of our sort of principal national or university libraries are those that were originally built up by aristocratic families and held in their homes. And while I think it's wonderful that those collections have been preserved and they're being made widely accessible, I think there is sort of a level of additional meaning to be gained from working with a collection that largely remains in situ. Many of the shelves are as they were when the Sixth Duke first arranged his new library. They give us an insight into the people who accumulated them, so they contain all sorts of interesting provenance marks, copy-specific information like coats of arms, ciphers, book plates, ownership inscriptions, annotations that have kind of built up in layers over time. So I think they're sort of intimately connected to the people who brought them together, who lived in these spaces. I think often country house libraries are untapped and under-researched sources for book history. So, here we're very much trying to improve access to the library and gradually get sections of it catalogued according to modern standards. So we've recently been working with a rare book consultant on ensuring our in-house book cataloguing guidelines are sort of fit for purpose in the 21st century. Currently, we're still quite heavily reliant on a catalogue published in 1879 and on various inventories made for insurance purposes and a shelf listing made in the 1990s. So although we've got a lot of that information into our collection management system, it's not really in a fit state to make available online yet. We've published some of our archive catalogues online, and of course, doing the same with the library catalogue is an aspiration for us. We do have quite a long history here of academic partnerships, sort of hosting PhD students as well as running placements, shorter placements for students. So in January, we're being joined by a PhD student for 2 months who's going to be helping us with our incunable collection. So trying to match our pre-1501 books up with the books that are listed in a resource called the Incunable Short Title Catalogue, just to know exactly what we have got, precisely which edition or issue. And that will hopefully lay the groundwork for larger projects focused on that very important part of the collection. So we have several hundred of those books. So, I think there's a lot of potential in country house libraries for, making new discoveries. So much of our library hasn't been researched yet. That it's this wonderful resource. And I think the family are very aware of the library's significance, and they take a great interest in what we do. So they're very supportive of the work we do in cataloguing and conservation. And they are also very keen to make the collections accessible to a wide audience. So not just researchers, but also wider audiences through talks, tours, exhibitions program, blogs, and the social media. So we've got a long way to go, but it's very exciting, and we're making progress with making the library more accessible.
Well, as a researcher and an historian, I think your point about these kinds of collections, providing untapped resources that maybe haven't been as heavily trafficked in terms of the scholarship and have a kind of value based on the fact that they are in situ, have with their provenance, with their context intact. I mean, it's really exciting what you're describing, and sounds like many years of exciting work ahead, both for you and your team and for others who come to make use of these wonderful resources. So speaking of general visitation, can you tell me a bit about what general visitors to Chatsworth House experience today when they come on the property?
Well, hopefully a wonderful visit. So we have a dedicated team of house guides who work throughout the visitor route in the house that people go around. They're really passionate about Chatsworth, and they're always happy to speak to visitors about the history of the house, its collections. And we also run training sessions for them during the short period of the year when the house isn't open. So new discoveries and that kind of thing from the collections can get fed into what's disseminated to people as they walk around the house. It's quite a long visitor route, so a large portion of the house is open to people to walk around. The interiors are stunning, amazing painted ceilings, elaborate wood and stone carving from the sort of 17th century, as well as a large display of artwork that really reflects the family's changing tastes over centuries. So each generation has added new works to the collections as well as commissioning work. So it is very much a living collection. So, the sculpture gallery that we have today, for example, in the 6th Duke's time, that was contemporary work. Now we've got contemporary ceramics installations by artists like Natasha Daintree and Edmund de Waal, sitting there alongside old masters. And I mentioned that recently the Duke's son and his family have moved into Chatsworth, so doubtless the house will be changing again to kind of reflect their particular interests. And as well as the sort of general visitor route, we do have a programme of annual changing exhibitions, which kind of run throughout the route. So this year's exhibition featured work by 16 contemporary designers who were responding to spaces in Chatsworth. So it was a sort of bespoke exhibition. Currently, we've got the Christmas display in place. This is always spectacular, and it's based around a different theme. So this year it's the Palace of Advent. Next year will be something equally extravagant and exciting. The main house exhibition running next year is called Picturing Childhood. So it's sort of celebrating children and their experience of the world as represented in art. So there are going to be at least one item from the archives featured, and we're going to be sort of running a few public sessions where we'll be showing books and archive material that have a kind of link to childhood, the childhood theme. I mean, we're spoilt for choice, really, so it's going to be hard to make the shortlist for that. But that will be very exciting. When people sort of go around the general visitor route, they do get to kind of peek through the door of the library, but they don't actually get the chance to walk through it, mainly because there's a very important Axminster carpet in there. So we have to try and limit footfall. But when we do special tours and sort of collection-focused items, people do get to actually come into the library and see some books in the library itself, which most people, I think, really appreciate. It's a really special experience. So I hope our visitors go away happy and satisfied.
I expect that they probably do. Now, we already discussed research and scholarship at the library a bit, but I want to plumb even deeper and just ask, from your perspective, what are some of the topics that are sort of ripe for exploration in the Chatsworth collection? I know you mentioned incunabula. What are some of the other areas of research that you think the collection really supports?
Well, I mean, I sort of so we have a study room, firstly, which is sort of open by appointment 3 days a week. So people who want to see the archives or items in the library can, make a booking to come in and see the material. In terms of the library holdings, we say, if you can get hold of a copy of the book more readily from another library, and you don't absolutely have to see the Chatsworth copy, then we would encourage them to go there, simply because we are limited in the number of people we can accommodate. But obviously, when you're talking about the hand press period before 1800, generally each book is unique. So there is a very good reason for people to actually come and look at the items on site, because, they might be rare, unique, have, interesting marks of provenance, other characteristics, etc. So we're at that time of year when we're sort of looking back and doing our statistics for the year, and, summarising what's been going on in the study room. And of course, we do answer lots of external inquiries, remote inquiries as well. So I've been sort of having a look at the library topics that have been explored by researchers this year, and they're very very wide-ranging. So we've had people interested in the illustrated botanical books and bird books, which are two big strengths of the collections. They're also, stunning. Duchess Georgiana's books, reading and book collecting, and she's always a perennial figure of interest. She's very popular. You mentioned the incunables. We've had people with very specific inquiries, which tends to be the case with incunables. You'll have a specific inquiry about a particular line of text or a particular leaf. We've had quite a bit of interest in atlases, so early Portolan, maritime kind of atlases, particular marks of provenance of the family, the Six Dukes bookbinding habits, books relating to Egypt, the manuscript transmission of early modern texts. So really kind of wide-ranging topics, and the scope for supporting all kinds of research into books and book history. So that's really just a tiny sample of what people have been doing this year. I think, the more we can get information about the library online, the larger or more varied those topics will become. I mean, one interesting area is sort of pamphlets and tracts. So we have, it must be 4,000 or more, and we haven't sort of enumerated them, but lots of bound volumes containing multiple kind of pamphlets on religious, scientific, different topics dating from the sort of 17th right through to the 19th centuries, which I think some of them are unique. So that's a kind of area of the collection I'd like to see, people working on. But so I think we can support a wide range of research really with the library.
Fascinating. Now, I do want to ask and close our conversation today with a question of personal interest. I read on your website that you hold musical manuscripts featuring harp compositions. I happen to be an amateur Celtic harpist, and I'm just curious to learn more about what your musical collection looks like.
Well, it's interesting because those are treated as kind of part of the archives rather than part of the library. But we had a very interesting project that we ran, I think last year, beginning of last year. A PhD student got in touch with us to ask about doing, with certain PhDs, you get the opportunity to do a 3-month placement called a researcher employability project. She was interested to see that we had a music collection, which was basically 2 boxes of manuscript and sheet music that we didn't really know an awful lot about. And we thought, well, we don't think it's terribly important, but, if you'd like to come and work on it and catalogue it for us, that would be great. So she was with us for around 3 months. She worked through that collection, managed to work out the provenance of all the different pieces of music. So they've now been integrated into the various family members' archives. She's also created some wonderful she calls them illustrated catalogues, but catalogues of some of the albums that have, the first few bars of the piece shown, and also a little audio clip of her playing those pieces on the piano. So we now have this wonderful catalogue that we can send out to music researchers, and there is harp music amongst it. It's mostly seems to have originated with a very particular branch of the family in the late 18th, early 19th century. And I'm sure, many other family members will have been musical and collected music. It's just the sort of accident of survival that it tends to be clustered in that particular area and focused on those particular family members. So we can certainly send you a very detailed catalogue of those pieces for you to peruse if you would like.
Oh my gosh, would I like? I would love it. And I think that's such a great example of how, one can have treasures sitting on a shelf, and it does take
realize.
Yeah. And it takes the time and labor and resources and institutional buy-in to say we need to sort of invest intellectually and financially in making this happen. So I would love to see that. I think that would be most interesting, and what a great idea to also, when possible, include some audio clips to help the music sort of resonate with a broader audience. I shall look forward to reviewing that this holiday season. Well, Fran, thank you so much for this really delightful and insightful conversation. I can't wait to share this podcast episode with our listeners and also post some pictures of Chatsworth, the library, and these various individuals whom you mentioned, and relevant collection items on our website. So thank you for sharing of your time and expertise.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach and to plan your visit to see treasures from the Rosenbach's collection, Literature of Great Britain and Ireland, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and we always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways you can support our work. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The Rosenbach Podcast is supported by a generous grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about the Rosenbach's treasures on the next episode of the Rosenbach Podcast.